Hey everybody, so not too long ago I had released a Patreon video called Movement in the Round, and in that I was talking about exactly the differences between Olympic fencing and fencing, for example, in a HEMA context, whereby in Olympic fencing you're basically fencing on a skinny rectangle, there's not a whole lot of left-right component to it, and in HEMA you're fighting in the round, meaning that there is a left-right component that you can move in order to do that. And in that video I talked about when to do it, when not to do it, I talked about how to do it and how not to do it. And as a result of that, I've gotten more questions from the subscribers. So I figured in this latest series of questions about that, these questions were actually very thought-provoking. And I thought, you know what, this is something that I'm sure is out there in the general community. So I thought I would release this as a public video because of the fact that this is kind of an important topic and there seems to be a lot of discussion on it. So today I'm going to talk to you addressing those questions about that video of Movement in the Round. Going forward on this, what I'm going to do is Lynn is going to go ahead and read the email with all of the questions on it, and then I'm going to address those from my own experience. Now, there may be others out there who have a different experience with this. That's perfectly fine, but do understand I've been doing this for 35 years, and I'm going to give from that perspective what I have found to be useful and offer my advice, and hopefully you find it of use. Okay, Lynn, so go ahead and read the questions, read the email from that Patreon subscriber, and we'll take it from there.
In some areas, possibly Central Europe or Eastern Europe, the quote-unquote rings are gradually replaced by narrower slots that look more like fencing strips. People from there seem to think that, number one, it's easier for the judges to place themselves and to maintain good angles.
So when you're talking about a HEMA context, that is absolutely true. If you're fencing on what's essentially the Olympic fencing strip, where it's just a long rectangle, it does make it very much easier for the judges to be able to position themselves, and they don't have to worry about that left-right component. There's been many tournaments, many bouts that I have been a judge or a director for, and yes, the fencers start turning and they're moving around, and yes, we as judges have to turn with them, and the possibility exists that if an attack was to occur while you're shifting like that, you could indeed miss some of the action. If you're fencing on the rectangle, yes, it is easier for directors and judges to be able to position themselves.
And the second part, people from there seem to think that, number two, no one is actually moving left or right, and no one should do that anyways.
Yes, most often that is going to be where the action happens. It's going to be straight on, the fencers moving toward each other, the fencers moving away from each other in a linear fashion.
The second reason is quite important to the topic of movement in the round that we are discussing here. After reading some related posts, I think that their arguments are, number one, if you are in range with no control and move sideways, you lost.
So this speaks directly to one of the points I made in that Patreon video called Movement in the Round, whereby, yes, if you are within striking range of your opponent, and you try to move laterally, that is going to cause your legs to cross, or at the very least, it's going to cause your stance to widen, which means then you do not have a force projection that's going to carry you away from your opponent. If your opponent chooses that moment to attack, and I'm telling you right now, I am one of those people that will do that, that reduces your opponent's defense by a full 50%, just because of the fact that they cannot move. And if they cannot move away, they cannot increase the distance, which means they cannot increase the time in order to buy them the time they need in order to mount a credible defense against what's coming in. So absolutely, if you are within range and you have no control and you're against a competent opponent, you're going to get smoked.
Number two, if you are in range with control and move sideways, you are wasting time. When you have control and are in range, you should attack directly. This will always give you better results than moving sideways.
So this is a scenario in which it is, again, it's dependent. So if I notice that my opponent has poor footwork, right, my moving left to right is in a attempt to try and put them into a disadvantageous position in terms of their footwork. I see it so often where a person does indeed have that. They have the poor footwork, and I will move left to right in order to put them in that position such that they can't get away when I actually commit to the attack.
And number three, if you are out of range, moving sideways gives you nothing and your opponent can easily turn towards you. Eventually, you will move into range with your opponent facing you, and then it turns into scenario number one or two.
So for the most part, that is indeed a correct statement. However, that is from a HEMA context. There are other contexts. I am one of these people that will fight in these other communities, say for example the SCA. And just to give you a quick story about how moving outside of your opponent's range is actually advantageous for you, is that I was fighting in a melee, meaning there was hundreds of people on their side and there were hundreds of people on our side. And as is my tendency to do, I break into the backfield of my opponents and I start killing the reserves. I get rid of the people that could be filling in the line that's happening behind us. Well, I did this on one particular battle. One of the enemy soldiers came up and they saw me as I had broken through the line, so he ran in order to engage me. Now keep in mind, during this battle, they had 3 painted rivers on the field, and they said if you touch those rivers, you are instantly dead. No ifs, ands, or buts. The person who I was facing knew exactly who I was. So he squared up with me, and he was just trying to do his best in order to stop me. So I moved a little to the left, and I noticed he moved a little to his left. That gave me an idea. I moved a little bit more to my left. Now mind you, neither one of us is in range right now. He also moved a little bit to his left. I took one more step to my left, and he moved again in order to make sure that he was square with me. And then I lowered my swords and I pointed down at the ground. He looked down, guess where he was standing? Right in the middle of the river. So it's dependent upon the scenario that you're fighting in. Because I can tell you right now, moving in the round, when you're in a melee scenario, when it's one person against multiple people, you need to have that component if you're going to be able to use that against your opponents. And let's not forget, when you're fighting in, say, for example, a wooded scenario, right? Many times do I position myself such that my opponent puts their back to a bush or a tree, and then I'll take that step toward them. And when they step back, when your opponent touches that obstacle behind them, for a brief moment, some of their thoughts are now thinking about what they just touched, and that lowers their defenses as well. So in a HEMA context, yes, you are correct. Moving in the round has less applicability, but when you're talking about one person versus many, or one person in a melee scenario, there are all kinds of opportunities and advantageous positions that you can take advantage of if you are fighting in that particular context. SCA, ARMA, whatever the case is, whatever your particular preference is. So HEMA, no. Other organizations, yes.
In conclusion, moving left or right is always worse than moving forward or backward, and it should not be encouraged. What do you think about this?
Moving left or right is not always to be discouraged. Again, because it comes down to that particular scenario. I have had instances, for example, where my opponent, and there are actually quite a lot of people like this, who will engage in the flesh attack. It seems to be their standby. Well, when I have somebody who is doing that all the time, well, their flesh attack comes in, I step to the side and parry, lay my sword out and continue moving to the oblique on this person while they run by. I end up cutting their throat as they go by. That's just one of a dozen different scenarios I could come up with off the top of my head. So no, it is not always not to be encouraged. It is not always disadvantageous. It's all dependent upon what your opponent shows to you.
Is it possible for you to come up with some scenarios in which moving left or right is actually gaining you more advantages compared to forward and backward?
So, as I had mentioned in those previous examples, when you're talking about a HEMA context, yes, there is less opportunity, less advantage to be gained by moving in a left-right component. Particularly, as I had mentioned, when you're the one person who's moving left-right, you're within range of your opponent and you don't have control of that weapon. It's not a good idea. It's going to end up it's going to cost you. Let's just put it that way. Because if you're facing me, I guarantee you I'm going to take advantage of that. And you're going to increase my odds of hitting you by no less than 50% if that is a practice that you engage in. But when you're talking about other scenarios, if you're like me and you fence in, for example, the SCA, if there's one thing that I enjoy the SCA for is the opportunity to fight in melee scenarios where there's, anywhere between dozens to hundreds of people on their army and dozens to hundreds of people on your army, and the two sides come together with the sole intent of wiping each other out. As is my practice, I like to break through to the other side and I end up engaging multiple people at a time. It is absolutely one of the funnest and most engaging challenges that I can think of for myself. So when I'm doing that, I absolutely have to have the ability to move in the round. It is indeed advantageous because when you're talking about fighting multiple people, say for example, I'm fighting 5 people, what I am doing is actually fighting 5 people who don't know how to fight as a team. And if you can move well in the round, you can break that line up and turn it up very quickly into a series of one-on-one fights. And even though you're engaging 5 people, you're really fighting them one at a time. That is just one way that moving in the round helps you as a fencer in order to engage superior numbers. There are 1,001 different ways that I could come up with and I could show you, but I think it is sufficient to say that, yes, in a HEMA context, less advantage to be found moving left to right. In a melee scenario, absolutely you need to be able to move in the round. Movement is absolutely critical to any fencer who wants to hope to survive a situation like that. So I know that there's a lot of conversation going on about movement. In my particular school of fence, I talk about the 3 pillars, which are, of course, balance, sword work, and ever so critical, footwork. If you don't have good footwork, it is fully the way that I'm going to end up taking my opponent out. It's whatever weakness it is that they show me, that's the obvious pathway you want to take. When it comes to the HEMA context, you don't really have much of a left-right component, and for the most part, yes, all of those out there who think that moving left-right doesn't really serve any sort of an effective purpose, you're not wrong. But there are some scenarios, some instances where your opponent is showing that they have poor footwork, and that in that particular case is going to be a time when you would indeed move offline. But as I mentioned in my video of movement in the round, you absolutely, if you're within range of your opponent, you have to have control. Just for that one tempo is all it takes, but you have to have control of your opponent's weapon in order to do that safely. Otherwise, you're gambling, and as we all know, luck eventually runs out. And if you're standing in front of me or anybody else who's got, mid-level of skill and above, they're going to make you eat steel because of the fact you made that mistake. So, HEMA context, not necessarily so much. Other contexts, melee scenarios, war scenarios, those are definitely absolutely critical, required that you can move in the round, because it does indeed have an advantage that can be conveyed to the fencer who knows how to use their footwork effectively.